Good evening. Welcome back. So tonight we finally get to the subject of interest, why it exists and what effects it has on the economy. As I mentioned in the last class, Silvio Gesell tells us that through thousands of years of human history, the phenomenon of interest had never been correctly explained. In fact, even up to the present day, there's still not a general consensus about why interest exists. That's a pretty amazing fact. So since there's no generally agreed upon theory, obviously I won't be able to give you a definitive, indisputable answer as to why interest exists. Barring that, the best we can do is examine the phenomenon of interest from a variety of different perspectives in order to develop a well-rounded understanding of the subject. Once we've done that, maybe you'll agree with me that Silvio Gesell's explanation of interest is the most logical and compelling of the competing theories. Maybe you won't. In either case, it will be a worthwhile exercise to consider the subject from several different angles. But first, we need to take a moment to discuss the definition of the word interest, because Silvio Gesell uses the word in a narrower sense than how it's used in everyday conversation. When we take out a car loan or a mortgage, that loan has an overall interest rate. But that rate actually consists of 4 distinct components, each of which serve different purposes and behave according to different principles. The first component is the so-called pure or risk-free interest. This is the part of the overall rate that is independent of the risk characteristics of the individual borrower or of changes in the purchasing power of money. The risk-free rate is usually approximated by using some standard interest rate on government debt. Since a government which borrows in its own currency can always create more of that currency if necessary in order to meet its obligations, there's no possibility of being forced into default. Of course, in the US, we're used to the spectacle of our legislators using the debt limit as a political tool and threatening default. But this is an entirely different thing. This is voluntary, not involuntary default. The US government could never be forced into involuntary default. The second component of interest is what's called the risk premium. This is an additional amount which is added to the risk-free rate to reflect the credit risk of the specific borrower. As we all know, a person with a poor credit history will pay a higher rate on a car loan than a person with good credit. Similarly, corporations with questionable finances and lower credit ratings pay higher rates on their bonds than more financially stable companies. The third component of interest is a measure of expected inflation or deflation. If the purchasing power of money changes over the course of a loan, that means the money used to repay the loan doesn't have the same purchasing power as the money that was originally borrowed. If there's inflation over the course of a loan, that means the money used to repay the loan has less purchasing power than the money that was originally lent. This benefits the borrower at the expense of the lender. Although it's less common, deflation has the opposite effect, shifting wealth from the borrower to the lender. So if the nominal interest rate on a loan is 8% and inflation over the course of the loan is 3%, the real rate, that is the rate after adjusting for changes in the purchasing power of money, is 5%. So most real-world interest rates include a component that reflects expected inflation or deflation. And the fourth component of interest is administrative costs. The issuer of a loan has to pay people to evaluate loan applications, collect and process payments, pursue recourse for non-payment, etc. And obviously, those people need to be paid. When we talk about interest from the Gesellian perspective, it's important to keep in mind that we are only talking about the first of those 4 components, so-called pure or risk-free interest. Gesell called it basic interest. Basic interest reflects the pure power of money to grow, independently of risk, expected changes in the purchasing power of money, or administrative costs. This is a very important distinction to keep in mind, because oftentimes when people first hear Gesell's condemnation of interest, they object that lenders need to be compensated for the risk involved in making a loan. And this is absolutely true. If lenders were not compensated for risk, only the most creditworthy of borrowers would ever be able to access credit. But this component of interest is not interest in the sense in which Gesell uses the word. It stems from different causes and obeys different principles. And the same goes for expected inflation or deflation and administrative costs. Gesell's critique of interest only applies to the pure power of money to grow. So now I'd like to talk a little bit about the different philosophical and moral perspectives on the subject of interest. Whether the charging of interest for lending money is moral or immoral, natural or unnatural, rational or irrational, is a subject that has drawn the attention not just of economists, but also of religious thinkers and philosophers for thousands of years. It's noteworthy that the Jewish, Christian, and Islamic religions all originally agreed that usury is sinful. And it's important to point out that the original definition of usury meant the charging of any interest, not just charging unusually high rates of interest, which is how most people use the word today. Some Christian theologians even considered usury a mortal sin, on the same moral level as murder. Other important thinkers, including Aristotle, considered the charging of interest to be an unnatural use of money. Aristotle distinguished between legitimate and illegitimate uses of money. He considered the use of money as a medium of exchange to be natural, but he viewed the use of money to make more money as unnatural. Aristotle's view of money is completely consistent with Silvio Gesell's view, although I would argue less fully developed. So personally, I would say that if Judaism, Christianity, Islam, and Aristotle all agree on something, that view should be given serious consideration. Many people underestimate the significance of interest. People who don't borrow or lend money generally think interest doesn't affect them. This couldn't be further from the truth. Interest is the circulatory principle of the blood of the economic organism. It affects virtually every aspect of the economy. It affects wages. It affects the prices of goods and services. It affects the availability and cost of housing. It makes ever greater concentration of wealth mathematically inevitable. It causes the boom and bust dynamic of the economy, which we erroneously refer to as the business cycle. And it's the main driver of our constant pursuit of growth, which puts us on a path toward environmental disaster. In order to grasp the power of interest, consider the following. If you invested 1 penny at 1% interest compounded monthly in the year 0, in the year 2000, that investment would have grown to $4.8 million. That's pretty amazing, right? 1 penny grows to over $4.5 million. Okay, so now we're going to play a guessing game. Let's change the interest rate from 1% to 2%. What do you think the end value of the investment in the year 2000 would be? Remember that with an interest rate of 1%, the final amount was $4.8 million. So what would it be with an interest rate of 2%? Please type your answers in the chat. Trillions? 2 people say trillions. All right, the consensus seems to be trillions. It's actually not a bad guess. The actual answer is $2.3 quadrillion. So the final value of 1 penny invested at 1% interest is $4.8 million, enough to buy a nice apartment in New York City. At 2%, that penny grows to enough to buy everything on earth 5 times. That's the power of compound interest. Over 2,000 years. There was a question in the chat asking over what period? 2,000 years. Over long periods of time, interest overwhelms everything. And this is because the growth of compound interest is an exponential mathematical function. And any exponential growth function eventually goes vertical if it continues unchecked. it eventually shoots toward infinity at an ever-accelerating rate. Let's look at this in visual form. Give me 1 second to share my screen. Okay. So this is the growth curve of an investment of 1 penny at 5% interest. I don't even know what the word is for the final value after 2,000 years. It has 41 zeros. The curve goes vertical around the year 300. Now let's look at the curve for 4%. It also goes vertical. It just does so a little bit later. And here's 3%, 2%, and 1%. They all go vertical eventually. And here's the thing. Unchecked exponential growth is completely at odds with the laws of nature. Nothing in nature grows that way. Bacteria or insects or rabbits might grow exponentially for a while, but eventually some limiting factor operates to stop the exponential growth. If this didn't happen, pretty soon bacteria, insects, or rabbits would crowd out everything else on Earth. But what limiting factor stops the growth of interest? Interest is a process that doesn't follow the laws of nature. And Silvio Gesell says this is because interest is an artificial, man-made phenomenon. Now let's make another observation about interest, which is related to the way in which money comes into existence in our monetary system. Many people have this image in their minds of government printing presses churning out dollar bills. We frequently see that image on TV as representative of the process of money creation, but that is not how most money gets created in our system. For the most part, new money comes into existence when banks issue loans. When a bank makes a loan, they simply credit the amount of the loan to the borrower's account, and voila, new money is created. It seems crazy, it doesn't seem to make sense, but that is the reality of how money comes into our existence in our system. Now consider this. Let's say a bank makes a loan of $1,000. They credit the borrower's account with $1,000, which the borrower can now spend, and $1,000 of new money is added to the money supply. Let's say the term of the loan is 30 years, and the interest rate is 7%. How much money must be repaid over the life of that loan? Obviously, the principal amount of $1,000 must be repaid. And in addition, the total amount of interest that must be paid over the course of the loan will amount to another $1,400. But remember, loan issuance is how money gets created, and only $1,000 was loaned. So $1,000 was created, but an eventual need for $2,400 resulted. Where will that additional money come from? The answer, in all likelihood, is more debt in the future. The dynamics of money creation through bank lending mean that scarcity is built into the system. There's never enough money to satisfy all outstanding obligations, and this necessitates more and more lending. The creation of money through lending sets in motion a hamster wheel of loans financed by more loans, and this process continues without limit or until the system collapses. It's often said that we are addicted to debt, as if this were some sort of choice or moral weakness, but that's not really an accurate description. The nature of money creation through bank lending makes the growth of debt mathematically inevitable. It's not a choice or a result of bad decisions by borrowers. To illustrate this dynamic, let's look at a few graphs. The first is the total amount of household debt in the US from 1945 to 2018. All right, so as I said, this is a graph of total US household debt from the year 1945 to 2018. As you can see, it starts from almost nothing and grows at a constantly accelerating rate up until around the time of the Great Financial Crisis in 2008, which temporarily stopped the steady upward trajectory, but it then resumed. This chart only goes to 2018. Since then, total household debt has surpassed $17 trillion. So if the chart was continued to the present, the curve would have gone off the top of the chart. Here is total corporate debt in the US over the same time period, although this one does not stop in 2018. It looks pretty similar. And here is total government debt from 1965 to the present. Again, looks pretty much the same. And it's not simply that households, corporations, and the government are all just getting more and more spendthrift, more addicted to debt. It's that the growth of debt is a mathematical inevitability in a system where lending is the mechanism for the creation of money. One of the foremost contemporary Gesellian scholars, Dr. Felix Fuders, a German economist who teaches at a university in Chile, makes the argument that the mathematical tendency of the money supply to constantly increase due to the dynamics of interest and money creation via bank loans is one of the main drivers of the so-called growth imperative, the constant pursuit of growth without regard to the environmental or social consequences. Last year, Felix published a book entitled How to Fulfill the UN Sustainability Goals, Rethinking the Role and Concept of Money in the Light of Sustainability, in which he makes the case that it is impossible to meaningfully address the problem of unsustainable growth without completely overhauling our monetary system along the lines proposed by Silvio Gesell. As I mentioned previously, that book, along with most of the sources I'm referencing in this course, can be found on the links page at silviogesell.com. In our first session, we mentioned Silvio Gesell's Robinson Crusoe parable. In the natural economic order, Gesell introduces the subject of interest by presenting his variation on the classic story. Keynes describes Gesell's Crusoe story as, quote, a most excellent economic parable, as good as anything of the kind that has been written, to demonstrate the point. Because it's so critical to wrapping our heads around the subject of interest, I'm going to read it in its entirety. So, here is the story of Robinson Crusoe as told by Silvio Gesell. To introduce the theory of interest here expounded, and to facilitate the removal of old prejudices, which are nowhere stronger than in connection with the subject of interest, I shall begin with the story of Robinson Crusoe. Robinson Crusoe, as is well known, built his house from motives of health on the south side of the mountain, whereas his crops grew on the damp but fruitful northern slopes. He was therefore obliged to carry his harvests over the mountain. To eliminate this labor, he decided to construct a canal around the mountain. The time required for this enterprise, which, to avoid silting, would have to be continued without interruption, he estimated at 3 years. He had therefore to lay in provisions for 3 years. He slaughtered some pigs and cured their flesh with salt. He filled a deep trench with wheat, covering it carefully with earth. He tanned a dozen buckskins for suits and nailed them up in a chest, enclosing also the stink glands of a skunk as a precaution against moths. In short, he provided amply and, as he thought, wisely for the coming 3 years. As he sat calculating for the last time whether his capital was sufficient for the projected undertaking, he was startled by the approach of a stranger, obviously the survivor of a shipwreck. "Hello, Crusoe," shouted the stranger as he approached. "My ship has gone down, but I like your island and intend to settle here. Will you help me with some provisions until I have brought a field into cultivation and harvested my first crops?" At these words, Crusoe's thoughts flew from his provisions to the possibility of interest and the attractions of life as a gentleman of independent means. He hastened to answer yes. "That's splendid," replied the stranger, "but I must say at once that I shall pay no interest. I would prefer to keep myself alive by hunting and fishing, for my religion forbids me to pay or to receive interest." Crusoe: "An admirable religion, but from what motive do you expect me to advance you provisions from my stores if you pay me no interest?" Stranger: "From pure egoism, my dear fellow, from your self-interest rightly understood, because you gain and gain enormously." Crusoe: "That, stranger, you have to prove. I confess that I can see no advantage in lending you my provisions free of interest." Stranger: "I shall prove it in black and white, and if you can follow my proof, you will agree to a loan without interest and thank me into the bargain." I need, first of all, clothes, for as you can see, I'm naked. Have you a supply of clothes? Crusoe, that chest is packed with buckskin suits. Stranger, my dear Crusoe, I had more respect for your intelligence. Just fancy nailing up clothes for 3 years in a chest. Buckskins, the favorite diet of moths. And buckskins must be kept aired and rubbed with grease, otherwise they become hard and brittle. Crusoe, that's true, but I have no choice in the matter. They would be no safer in my clothes cupboard, less safe indeed, for it is infested by rats and mice as well as by moths. Stranger, the mice will get them in any case. Look how they've already started to gnaw their way in. Crusoe, confound the brutes, I'm helpless against them. Stranger, what? A human being helpless against mice? I'll show you how to protect yourself against rats and mice and moths, against thieves and brittleness, dust and mildew. Lend me these clothes, 1, 2, or 3 years, and I agree to make you new clothes as soon as you require them. You will receive as many suits as you've lent me, and the new suits will be far superior to those you would have taken from this chest. Nor will you regret the absence of the particular perfume you've employed. Do you agree? Crusoe, yes, stranger, I agree to lend you the chest of clothes. I can see that in this case, the loan, even without interest, is to my advantage. Stranger, now show me your wheat. I need some for bread and seed. Crusoe, it's buried in this mound. Stranger, wheat buried for 3 years? What about mildew and beetles? Crusoe, I've thought of them and considered every other possibility, but this is the best I can do. Stranger, just bend down a moment. Observe this beetle crawling on the surface of the mound. Note the garbage in the spreading patch of mildew. It's high time to take out and air the wheat. Crusoe, this capital will be my ruin. If I could only find some method of protecting myself against the 1,000 destructive forces of nature. Stranger, let me tell you, Crusoe, how we manage at home. We build a dry and airy shed and shake out the wheat on the boarded floor. Every 3 weeks, the whole mass is turned over with wooden shovels. We also keep a number of cats. We set mouse traps and insure against fire. In this way, we keep the annual depreciation down to 10%. Crusoe, but the labor and expense. Stranger, exactly. You shrink from the labor and expense. In that case, you have another course. Lend me your wheat and I shall replace it, pound for pound, sack for sack, with fresh wheat from my harvest. You thus save the labor of building the shed and turning over the wheat. You need feed no cats and you avoid the loss of weight, and instead of moldy rubbish, you will have fresh, nutritious wheat. Crusoe, with all my heart, I accept your proposal. Stranger, that is, you will lend me your wheat free of interest. Crusoe, certainly, without interest and with my best thanks. Stranger, but I can only use part of the wheat. I don't need it all. Crusoe, suppose I give you the whole store with the understanding that for every 10 sacks lent, you give me back 9 sacks. Stranger, I must decline your offer, for it would mean interest, not indeed positive, but negative interest. The receiver, not the giver of the loan, would be a capitalist, and my religion does not permit usury. Even negative interest is forbidden. I propose, therefore, the following agreement. Entrust me with the supervision of your wheat, the construction of the shed, and whatever else is necessary. In return, you can pay me annually from every 10 sacks, 2 sacks as wages. Crusoe, it makes no difference to me whether your service comes under the heading of usury or of labor. The agreement, then, is that I give you 10 sacks and that you give me back 8 sacks. Stranger, but I need other articles, a plow, a cart, and tools. Do you consent to lend them also without interest? I promise to return everything in perfect order. A new spade for a new spade, a new unrusted chain for a new chain, and so forth. Crusoe, of course I consent. All I have at present from my stores is work. Lately, the river overflowed and flooded the shed, covering everything with mud. Then a storm blew off the roof and everything was damaged by rain. Now we have a drought and wind is blowing in sand and dust. Rust, decay, breakage, drought, light, darkness, dry rot, ants, keep up a never-ending attack. We can congratulate ourselves here upon having at least no thieves and incendiaries. I'm delighted that by means of a loan, I can now store my belongings without expense, labor, loss, or vexation until I need them later. Stranger. That is, you now see the advantage you gain by lending me your provisions free of interest. Crusoe. Of course I do. But the question now occurs to me, why do similar stores of provisions at home bring their possessors interest? Stranger. The explanation lies in money, which is there the medium of such transactions. Crusoe. What? The cause of interest lies in money? That's impossible, for listen to what Marx says of money and interest. Work is the source of interest, surplus value. Interest, which converts money into capital, cannot be derived from money. If it is true that money is a medium of exchange, then its function is merely to pay the price of the goods which it purchases. If it thus remains unchanged, it cannot increase in value. Surplus value, interest, must therefore be derived from the goods purchased, which are sold at an increase of price. This can neither occur at the time of purchase nor at the time of sale, for on these occasions equivalents are exchanged. The only remaining hypothesis is, therefore, that the change happens through the use of the goods after their purchase and before their sale. Stranger. How long have you been on this island? Crusoe. 30 years. Stranger. I thought so. You still appeal to the theory of value. My dear sir, that theory is dead and buried. At the present day, it has no representatives. Crusoe. What? You assert that Marx's theory of interest is dead and buried? Even if no one else represents it, I represent it. Stranger. Well then, represent it, not only in theory, but also in practice, if you wish, in relation to me. I hereby break off the bargain we've just made. From their nature and destination, your goods are the purest form of what is usually called capital. I challenge you to take up the position of a capitalist toward me. I need your stuff. No worker ever appeared before a capitalist as naked as I stand before you. Never has there been such a clear illustration of the relation between the owner of capital and the individual in need of capital. And now, make the attempt to exact interest. Shall we begin our bargaining again from the beginning? Crusoe. Surrender. Rats, moths, and rust have broken my power as a capitalist. But tell me, what is your explanation of interest? Stranger. The explanation is simple enough. If there were a monetary system on this island, and I, a shipwrecked traveler, needed a loan, I would have to apply to a moneylender for money to buy the things which you have just lent me without interest. But a moneylender has not to worry about rats, moths, rust, roof repairing. So I could not have taken up the position toward him that I have taken up toward you. The loss inseparable from the ownership of goods, there's the dog running off with one of your, or rather my, buckskins, is borne not by moneylenders, but by those who have to store the goods. The moneylender is free from such cares and is unmoved by the ingenious arguments which found the joints in your armor. You did not nail up your chest of buckskins when I refused to pay interest. The nature of your capital made you willing to continue the negotiations. Not so the money capitalist. He would bang the door of his strong room before my face if I announced that I would pay no interest. Yet I do not need the money itself. I only need money to buy buckskins. The buckskins you give me without interest, but upon the money to buy buckskins, I must pay interest. Crusoe. Then the cause of interest is to be sought in money, and Marx is wrong? Stranger. Of course Marx is wrong. He underestimated the importance of money, the nervous system of economic life. So it is not surprising that he went wrong over things of fundamental importance. Like all of his disciples, he made the mistake of excluding money from the scope of his inquiry. He was fascinated by the shining metal discs. Otherwise, he could never have used the following words. Gold and silver are not by nature money, but money is by nature gold and silver. Witness the coincidence of their natural properties with its functions. Crusoe. Practice certainly does not agree with Marx's theory. That has been clearly proven by our negotiations. Money is for Marx only a medium of exchange, but money does more, it seems, than merely pay the price of the goods it purchases. When the borrower refuses to pay interest, the banker can bang the door of his safe without experiencing any of the cares which beset the owner of goods, capital. That is the root of the matter. Stranger. Rats, moths, and rust are powerful logicians. A single hour of economic practice has taught you more than years of study in the textbooks. Okay, so now let's remind ourselves of something we've discussed before, namely the fact that both the classical and Marxist economic perspectives ignore the existence of money. For them, gold and silver money were just commodities, no different in their fundamental natures than wheat or iron or oil. So if that's the way you look at the economy, obviously the idea that interest is caused by money would never occur to you. Therefore, the classical school and the Marxists share the view that interest originates in the nature of real capital and is then transferred to money simply because money can be exchanged for real capital. As we'll see, this is the exact opposite of the Gessellian view of interest. So let's review the main non-Gessellian theories of interest. The main theory of interest at the time Gesell was writing was the productivity theory. This theory says that since lenders provide borrowers with useful capital, which increases the productivity of labor, lenders are therefore entitled to receive a portion of the additional wealth produced through the use of that capital. It's a superficially appealing argument. After all, it's obviously true that labor is more productive when it has access to capital than without it. So why shouldn't the lenders who enable labor to have access to capital get part of the additional wealth that is thereby created? And this view is one of the widely held economic beliefs that the Robinson Crusoe story was designed to debunk. When we think about the negotiation between Crusoe and the stranger, what we see is that the productivity theory only considers half of the picture. Yes, it's true that the stranger will benefit through having access to the capital that Crusoe has accumulated. But the productivity theory takes no account of the fact that Crusoe will benefit as well. Since both parties are better off as a result of lending, why should either party pay the other for the privilege of entering into the agreement? After all, if one makes the argument that the stranger should pay Crusoe because he'll benefit through having access to Crusoe's capital, why couldn't one just as easily make the argument that Crusoe should pay the stranger, since he'll benefit by way of having his capital, which would otherwise deteriorate, be preserved? In fact, Gesell included a footnote in the story that I didn't read, which makes this point clearly. In it, he asks us to consider how the situation would be different if instead of the stranger arriving on an island with only one person on it, there had instead been two Crusoes living on the island. Imagine a situation in which Robinson Crusoe and Frank Crusoe were on the island before the stranger's arrival, and both of them had accumulated stores of capital. Now there would be a bidding war between the two Crusoes to see who could win the privilege of lending their capital to the stranger, because the losing bidder would see his capital consumed by insects, rats, mold, etc. Viewed in this way, why would we assume that interest in an economy composed only of goods and services would be positive? There's an equally compelling argument that says interest should be negative. With that thought in mind, I'd like to once again read the first paragraph of the Natural Economic Order. Gesell writes, "The abolition of unearned income, of so-called surplus value, also termed interest and rent, is the immediate economic aim of every socialistic movement. The method generally proposed for the attainment of this aim is communism in the shape of nationalization or socialization of production. I know of only one socialist, Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, whose investigations into the nature of capital point to the possibility of another solution of the problem. The demand for nationalization of production is advocated on the plea that the nature of the means of production necessitates it. It is usually asserted offhand as a truism that ownership of the means of production must necessarily, in all circumstances, give the capitalist the upper hand when bargaining with the workers about wages. an advantage represented and destined eternally to be represented by surplus value or capital interest. No one except Proudhon was able to conceive that the preponderance now manifestly on the side of property can be shifted to the side of the dispossessed, the workers, simply by the construction of a new house beside every existing house, of a new factory beside every factory already established. So do you see how the Robinson Crusoe parable sheds light on what Gesell was talking about in this paragraph? Do you see how the construction of a house beside every existing house and a factory beside every factory already established would shift the preponderance of power from the owners of capital to labor? And this is the essence of the Gesellian solution to economic inequality. Once we get to Gesell's explanation of interest, we'll show how his diagnosis of the cause of surplus value is essentially opposite that of Karl Marx. Gesell tells us that the existence of interest arising from our unnatural form of money puts an artificial limit on the creation of capital, thus causing capital to always be scarce. And it's this artificial scarcity to which Gesell attributes the exploitative power of capital. If the process of capital formation was not short-circuited by our form of money, we would have far more productive capital than we currently have. And what would that do to the balance of power between capital and labor? Obviously, it would greatly increase the demand for labor, since you need workers to employ all of that additional capital. So according to this view, there's nothing inherent in the private ownership of the means of production which enables capital to exploit labor. Rather, it is the distorting effect of money on the creation of capital that causes it to always be scarce, which in turn gives the owners of capital an unnatural advantage when negotiating wages with labor. If this is the case, the way to eliminate the ability of capitalists to exploit labor is to get rid of the artificial brake on capital formation, which would result in much more capital, and thus a shift of power from the owners of the means of production to labor. This is what Gesell means when he says that the preponderance now manifestly on the side of property can be shifted to labor simply by unleashing the natural process of capital formation. So to return to the subject of interest, Gesell's view is that in a natural economy, one without interest, borrowing and lending is a mutually beneficial symbiotic relationship where both parties benefit, but neither party benefits at the expense of the other. The stranger benefits through the increased productivity of his labor due to having access to Crusoe's capital, and Crusoe benefits through protecting his capital from the natural processes of decay by lending it to the stranger and receiving in the future sacks of fresh wheat instead of moldy, insect-ridden wheat that he would have had if he didn't lend it. Okay, moving on to other theories of interest. Next, I'll briefly mention the so-called abstinence theory, not because it's relevant today, but because it's related to another theory which is ascendant in modern neoclassical economic thought. The abstinence theory states that interest is a reward that holders of wealth receive to compensate them for not consuming it. The question I posed in the first class about whether a squirrel ever stores nuts and comes back later to find more nuts is designed, among other things, to highlight the fact that perspectives like the abstinence theory are completely at odds with the laws of nature. If one abstains from drinking a gallon of milk, does the milk increase in value? If one abstains from using a factory full of machinery and supplies, does the factory become more valuable? Does a warehouse full of inventory gain value with the passage of time? No, in all cases, the opposite happens. A gallon of milk, an idle factory, and a warehouse of inventory all lose value with the passage of time. Even gold, that exceptional form of matter that is immune to decay, still imposes the costs of storage and security on its owners. If you had your net worth in the form of gold stored in your house, would you feel secure? Would you be willing to pay someone to store it and protect it for you? If so, that means your gold would generate negative, not positive interest. In terms of modern economic thought, the abstinence theory is dead and buried, but the related time preference theory is alive and well. This theory is associated with the Austrian School of Economics and is based on the idea that humans prefer present consumption to future consumption, and therefore must be rewarded for postponing their consumption and thus making capital available for investment. This seems to posit a view of human nature whereby people are unthinking gluttons who would consume everything they have as soon as possible if they weren't offered a reward for refraining from doing so. Personally, I find this view unpersuasive. In fact, I would argue that human nature works the exact opposite way. Time preference says that in order to refrain from consuming $100 worth of wealth right away, one needs to be offered, let's say, $110 of wealth at some point in the future. And sure, while there are certainly people who go straight to the bar when they get their paychecks and thus express a positive time preference, is this kind of behavior general enough to base a theory of interest upon it? What about the opposite tendency? That is, people in the prime of their lives who recognize that they won't always have health and the ability to work and who want to provide for their old age. Do those people need to be rewarded for postponing consumption? I would argue just the opposite. I think there are a lot of people who would willingly trade $100 of present consumption for $90 of consumption in retirement, assuming, of course, no change in the price level, because the idea of being destitute in old age is terrifying to people. This attitude would imply negative time preference. So ask yourself, which of these two descriptions of human nature do you believe is more generally accurate when applied to the population as a whole? Spendthrifts running off to the bar to blow their paychecks on booze, or people who want to be comfortable in old age and will therefore be willing to postpone consumption even if they don't receive a reward for doing so? And let's challenge the concept of time preference by asking a few questions. Would you prefer to have 52 gallons of milk today or a gallon of milk a week for the next year? If you chose the latter, you expressed a negative time preference. Would you prefer to take 10 piano lessons today or take 1 piano lesson a week for the next 10 weeks? Again, the latter answer reflects negative time preference. Contemporary mainstream neoclassical economics has developed what's referred to as a real theory of interest, which is essentially a combination of the productivity and time preference theories. If you study economics at any major university, that's the theory of interest you'll be taught. But I find neither the productivity theory nor the time preference theory to be convincing. Obviously, you should all decide for yourselves whether you find them convincing. Lastly, let's talk about the fructification theory. Quite frankly, if it wasn't for the fact that this course is being presented by the Henry George School, I probably wouldn't include fructification in a discussion of mainstream theories of interest. Fructification these days is mainly considered as being of historical interest rather than being part of the modern day understanding of interest. However, Henry George was an adherent of the fructification theory, so it's therefore appropriate to discuss it in this course. Fructification says that the root cause of the phenomenon of interest is the fertility of nature. This view goes back to the late 18th century and the French economist Turgot. According to this view, a holder of money has a choice between lending that money or buying land. And since ownership of land entitles the owner to the wealth created by the productive forces of nature, people will not choose to lend money unless the return they're offered matches the return they can earn through land ownership. Henry George echoes this view in Progress and Poverty when he writes, "Interest springs from the power of increase which the reproductive forces of nature and the, in effect, analogous capacity for exchange give to capital. It is not an arbitrary but a natural thing. It is not the result of a particular social organization, but of laws of the universe which underlie society. It is therefore just." Honestly, I find it quite amazing that he wrote those words, because they strike me as being completely at odds with his main thesis. His statement reflects an idea that I expressed last week, that virtually all wealth on earth comes from two sources, the bounty of nature and the power of collaborative production and exchange made possible through the division of labor. In comparison with those two things, individual effort is a minuscule contributing factor to the creation of wealth. So if George is correct that the cause of interest is the fertility of nature and the collaborative potential of society, how on earth can he conclude that the privatization of the wealth that springs from these two sources is natural and just? I can't square that with the rest of Henry George's economic perspective. Furthermore, I don't agree with his statement that interest is independent of our model of social organization. Because if we were to implement his proposed land reform, which aims at taxing away the full value of raw land, wouldn't that result in the elimination of interest, if interest is in fact caused by the productive forces of nature? So personally, I lean toward the conclusion that Henry George didn't fully understand the subject of money, and therefore couldn't resolve the contradiction between his view of land and his analysis of interest. I know I'm flirting with disaster by coming into the house of Henry George and finding fault with Henry George's analysis. And I'm sure some of you will challenge me on this point when we open the floor for questions. And I'm totally open to hearing why I'm wrong in seeing this as an inconsistency on George's part. But as it stands, since I completely agree with George's view that allowing private individuals to own nature is unjust, it seems clear to me that if we eliminate that injustice, either through George's solution of land taxation or through Gesell's proposal of community ownership of land, ownership of the productive powers of nature would be restored to society, which would be rational, natural, and just. So the fact that under our existing system of interest, which according to George is rooted in the privatization of those powers, goes to private individuals who have not created it, is irrational, unnatural, and unjust. And this is why I view Silvio Gesell as a completion of the Georgist perspective. I don't think Henry George fully understood money, and I think Gesell did. But setting aside who deserves the credit, I'll repeat once again Gesell's statement from the introduction to his book, in which he says, "Of the discoverer's name, truth takes no account." I don't really care who gets credit for coming up with the correct analysis of the subject. What matters to me is that we get the analysis right. Lastly, I want to mention that I'm postponing the discussion of one more important theory of interest, namely the Keynesian liquidity preference theory. The reason I'm choosing not to discuss it at this point is because it came after Gesell, and in my view, it's largely built on the foundation of the Gesellian view on interest. So it wouldn't make sense to talk about the liquidity preference theory until we've covered Gesell's theory of basic interest. In a future class, we'll look in depth at the similarities and differences between the Gesellian and Keynesian perspectives on interest. All right, so I'm going to leave off there for today. In the next session, now that we've surveyed the competing theories, we'll get into the specifics of Silvio Gesell's explanation for the existence of interest and how it is not rooted in the productivity of capital, in human nature, or in the productive forces of nature, but rather is a consequence of our irrational form of money.